Hey, good friends of the good Lori. Welcome to True Crime Wednesday. I'm your host, the good Lori Hellis, and this is Children of Darkness and Light, which is my YouTube channel. And we've got a lot to talk about tonight. As usual, I'll do a few little recaps for about the first half hour, and then we'll take your questions for the second half. If y'all could hold your questions until we ask, you have a much better chance of Michelle spotting questions and getting them posted up for me. So, with that, I'm just going to make a couple of little announcements while we wait for folks to join us. You'll see at the bottom of our crawler there all of our super chat donations and everything that comes in through PayPal goes directly to our moderators. So thank you so much for your generous support for them because they totally deserve it. I couldn't do this without them, and I appreciate them more than I can say. Please, if you have not subscribed to the channel, and it's interesting, I'm still getting comments from people saying, I just found you. So share the link if you have friends who you think might enjoy the show. And and please, if you're just joining us, please subscribe and hit the like button because we know that that helps us move up in the algorithm. Um, so we have a couple things, housekeeping things to talk about. I put a new newsletter out today, so if you haven't seen that, it deals specifically with the Vallow Daybell case, as it usually does. There's also a couple of holiday recipes in there, so enjoy those. Just an announcement that next week for the Christmas holiday, we will not have a Wednesday night true crime, and we will not have our usual Friday night Vallow Daybell TGIF because I'm looking forward to spending some time with my family and doing lots of cooking and baking and having lots of fun with them. So, without further ado, tonight I wanted to talk a little bit about missing children cases. Now, of course, the Vallow Daybell case, which is how I got started with all this, is kind of like the ultimate missing children case. Um, I, for those of you who might be new to the case, although it's hard to believe somebody could be at this point, or isn't that familiar with the facts. Lori Vallow Daybell, she moved to Rexburg, Idaho to be closer to Chad Daybell. And within about 2 weeks of her moving there in early September of 2019, her children, 7-year-old JJ Vallow and 16-year-old Tylee Ryan, disappeared. Tylee disappeared first, about a week or so after Lori arrived in Rexburg. The last known sighting for Tylee was on a trip to Yellowstone, which is nearby Rexburg, and she was seen in photographs and seen going into the park on CCTV, but those were the last sightings for her. So about 2 weeks later, then little JJ disappeared as well. And his paternal grandparents reported him missing, reported that they had concerns and asked the police in Rexburg to do a welfare check the day before Thanksgiving. Within a day or so, Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell had disappeared. They turned up in Hawaii several weeks later, and it was determined that the children were not with them. And for the next 6 months, law enforcement continued to search for the children, and Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell refused to say anything about where the children were. Then in June of 2020, the children's bodies were recovered, having been buried in Chad Daybell's backyard, in the backyard of his Fremont County, Idaho home. So, but missing children are way more common than people think or realize. Um, the statistics show that over 500,000 children go missing every year, but 97% of those children are recovered. Many of them have to do with parental kidnapping or with children who run away, children who are exploited in one way or the other, get involved in groups that resort to human trafficking. Um, and the statistics show, thanks in a great deal to the Center for Missing and Exploited Children, most of those children are recovered. 97% of them are recovered. So what we hear about are the unusual cases where children either are murdered or are never recovered. And those missing children cases are interesting to us for a number of reasons, because we wonder, um, how do parents lose their children? We wonder, were the parents involved? We wonder how this could happen. And some of those cases go back for a very long time. So I wanted to take a look at a few of cases that were of interest to me. Um, and I guess just to point out that um, missing children is not a new phenomenon. Children go missing uh, often. And for many years, children have gone missing. And I think it's interesting that there are occurrences where there are accidents and people panic, and the result is a missing child rather than an honest report that a child was um, killed accidentally. Um, there is suggestion, and I know there are a lot of very strong feelings about the Casey Anthony case. Casey Anthony recently has had a documentary that has been on Peacock Network, I think. And a lot of people have a lot of very strong feelings about that case. I have read both the prosecutor and the defense's books. I have not watched the documentary yet, and I do intend right after the first of the year, after the holidays, to do a True Crime Wednesday just about the Casey Anthony case. So stay tuned for that if that is a case that interests you. But this was another case where a child was missing. A grandparent suggested that they were concerned that the child hadn't been heard from. Grandmother didn't know where the child was. And there were some indications that perhaps there was an odor in the mother's trunk of the mother's car. The mother claimed that it was bags of garbage that she needed to take to a garbage dump or to a dumpster. Um, there also were suggestions. This was Casey Anthony's case was in Florida, and the family had an above ground swimming pool. And there has always been a suggestion that it is possible that someone left the ladder to the swimming pool up. It was their habit to take it down so that Kaylee couldn't get into the pool. But there was some suggestion that ladder was left up and she got into the pool and drowned. Um, I realize that there are a lot of strong feelings about this case, and I'm not defending anyone. But I think that sometimes what happens is a child dies accidentally and the family panics and does something foolish, and really makes the whole situation much worse. So one of those cases, which has always been of interest to me, is the disappearance of Thomas Gibson. He was a little guy. He was just about 3, and he disappeared from Southern Oregon. in a small town called Azalea, where his father was a deputy sheriff, a Douglas County, Oregon deputy sheriff. And the story was the initial story was that the boy was playing in the yard. Dad left and left the little boy in the care of his uh, his daughter, who was only at that point about 4 years old herself, and then went off on a run, and came back, and the boy was missing. There was also a story that he told saying that he had been washing his car, that the little boy was playing in the yard. At some point, he was distracted, and when he came back or uh, started paying attention again, that the little boy was missing. Um, Much later, um, I want to get the story straight, so I'm just making sure that I have the information. Much later, the little girl told a story that a man and a woman had driven up in a car and taken the little boy. Now, remember, she was 4 at the time, so this is a really impressionable age. She could have been aggressively questioned in a way that planted that by her parents, in a way that planted that story. She could have been coached, because much later she would say uh, that she actually after her parents were divorced and she was away from the father, she did say that she actually had seen the father beat the little boy and then put him in the trunk of his car. The Now let's recall this was 1991. So forensics were not nearly as advanced as they are now, but there was indication that the boy had been in the trunk of the car, that the child's body had been in the trunk of the car. And there was mileage on the father's car that was unaccounted for. He was driving his official sheriff's car, and there was mileage on the car that was unaccounted for. So later, he was charged in 1993, or no, I'm sorry, 1995. He was charged with manslaughter, resulting in the child's death. He then later told the story that possibly while he was washing his car, he backed his car up and backed over the little boy. I think that was his final defense theory. He was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, and he served less than a year before he was released. It was always a pretty thin case, and there was always speculation that the child had been killed by accident, that he had panicked because he was a deputy sheriff and thought he was going to lose his job, and made up the story that the child had been kidnapped and then disposed of his body. Little Thomas Gibson, I'll post a picture here of him. His remains were never found. So that kind of illustrates that these are not new stories, that missing children aren't necessarily anything new, and that there are many unsolved cases. I suppose you could say that little Thomas Gibson's case was solved, although his remains were never found. So let's move on and talk about a couple of other cases. This case is one that has always interested me. Again, happened in Oregon, in Southern Oregon. This was a case where this girl, her name is Stephanie Condon. She was 14, and this case happened in 1998. Um, Stephanie was 14. She was babysitting for her cousin's twin toddlers, and while her cousin went out, again, small town area in Southern Oregon, and the mother and her current boyfriend went out, and they were out at the local watering hole when apparently they were spotted by the man in this picture, whose name is Dale Hill. And Dale Hill had some sort of involvement with the the mother of the toddlers prior to her new boyfriend, and there was some sort of a dispute, let's say, about about her seeing somebody else. And then it is theorized that he went back to her house and kidnapped and raped and murdered the babysitter. Um, Her remains remained unlocated until 2009. So more than 10 years later, a man walking his dog found her remains and they were recovered. He then was prosecuted and interestingly enough was acquitted on charges of having murdered Stephanie Condon. She was 14. So, um, i- one of the issues that happens in cases where there are, it's a long period of time before remains are found, is that the forensic evidence, of course, is very degraded, and they're clearly they didn't have enough to prove their case. So, and then I want to talk about three that have been a little bit more are a little more current and have been in the news and have been talked about by podcasters pretty frequently recently. The first is little Dior Coons, and little Dior was 2.5. He was he went camping with his mother, father, grandfather, and a friend of grandfather's. They were camping. Interestingly enough, these have all happened in most of these have happened in Idaho. And he went camping and disappeared from the campground. The contention from the parents was that they left him in the care of grandfather. Grandfather thought that Dior had gone with his parents because they were going down to the lake to fish. And when the parents came back and realized Dior wasn't with grandfather, they started the search. His remains were never located. Has never been any clear indication where he was. A massive, massive search was put on for him for 2 weeks. They dove the reservoir. They used helicopters with infrared FLIR equipped helicopters. They used dogs. They really tried to everything that they could to find him. And unfortunately, he was never found. Law enforcement have indicated that they felt that the parents were the most likely suspects, and that likely there was some sort of an injury or an accident. His blood was found on the bumper and the fender area of the family truck, and there was some suggestion that perhaps he had been accidentally injured or killed, and again, his body uh, was hidden. This one happened in 2015, and to date, it remains unsolved. His body's not been recovered. So but it's interesting because if you look online, you can see a fairly recent interview that Nate Eaton did with East Idaho News. I think it's about a year old, talking about the ongoing search and the fact that it had been somewhere along the lines of 6 years, and um, no 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 progress had really been made on it. So, um, and then I want to talk a little bit about little Quinton Simon. This is Quinton. This is his mother, Leilani. Um, and she has recently been arrested. You may recall, because this is a current case, Leilani was arrested after she tried to blame the child's biological father, saying that he had to come and taken the boy. The grandmother, who had legal custody of little Quinton and a sibling, was concerned about whether or not her daughter had done something untoward to the child. And after nearly a month of searching, law enforcement did recover his remains. He had been disposed of in a dumpster, and they recovered his remains in landfill. Anytime law enforcement is searching a landfill, it is a huge undertaking. It is like looking for a needle in a haystack. So you really have to commend them for that, for sticking with it for a month and until they found him. Um, there's been an interesting twist to it because his grandmother, her name is Billy Joe uh, Betterton, was arrested a couple of days ago for contempt of court. And it's odd because the court has not released any details about what the contempt was, why she was arrested, but she is now in jail as well. Um, I don't really know whether this is sort of a placeholder, that at some point they've got her in custody and they are going to charge her with other charges related to Quinton's death, or whether this is strictly an unrelated issue. Um, the contempt of court comes out of the juvenile court, which typically means that this has something to do with a child welfare case. She did have legal custody of both her grandchildren, both of Leilani's children. So it does kind of make you wonder what the contempt will be. Juvenile court records are typically sealed, and so you don't often get a lot of information in juvenile court proceedings. And I suspect in this case, we may not know for quite some time why it is that grandma has been arrested. But now both grandma and mom are in custody. So I thought that was interesting. That is certainly a developing case. The other interesting and developing case is Little Monkey Vaughn. Those of you who follow Hidden True Crime, Lauren did an interview with his mother several months ago, and he has been missing for more than a year. And only recently we found out that the neighbors nearby were were the law enforcement got a warrant and was digging up their backyard, and digging up a neighbor's backyard. And law enforcement held a press conference recently. The people who lived in the home were Sarah and Stacy Wondra. They also had some friends who were in and out of the house. This fellow's name is Adrian Lucien, and he is suspected to be in Toledo, Ohio, Ohio. Sorry. This fellow's name is Brandon Shirtliff. He they thought was living in Kuna, Idaho, which is in the Boise area. But there've been some other suggestions that he's out of state as well. Law enforcement has asked for them to come forward, and so far as we know, they have not had any contact with law enforcement. Sarah Wondra was arrested on a charge of failing to report a dead body. She recently, her attorneys asked for her to have a mental health evaluation. And as a result of that evaluation, she has been committed to Idaho Health and Welfare for Restoration Treatment, sounding kind of like Lori Vallow, because they said she was not competent. Stacy Wondra is in jail, but on unrelated charges. So that one will be very interesting to keep an eye on and keep watching. Law enforcement said that cadaver dogs in the yard alerted in an area that they excavated, but they did not find remains, and they believe that at one point, little Michael's body probably was there and has since been moved. And none of the 4 people involved have disclosed where that might be. I do want to draw everybody's attention to this amazing project. And the link to this is in our show notes, so please go there if you have questions. I realize that this isn't that this image isn't huge. Let me see if I can get it on the screen a little bit bigger without my face in there. One of our true crime community, Megan Music, who is lots of people know Megan. She's been involved in several of the Facebook groups, and she's a supporter of hidden true crime, started this Christmas Miracle Project. When Lauren from Hidden True Crime reached out to Monkey's mother and asked, is there something we can do for the family? She said, little Michael loved Christmas and he loved giving gifts. And so she asked for social media followers to support needy children in the Fruitland, Idaho area. And Megan Music started this project where you can go to the Amazon gift list and buy a gift that it will be delivered to the family to a location in Fruitland and will be distributed to needy kids in that area. So it was a great idea. It's a terrific project, and I really hope that y'all will get behind that. I know that there are duplicates and triplicates of pretty much every gift on that list that has been purchased, but they welcome duplicate gifts and are encouraging people to continue to contribute to buy gifts off that list so that the kids in the Fruitland, Idaho area can have a Merry Christmas. So now it looks like we're about at the point where we need to take some questions. So while Michelle is rounding up those questions, I just want to say thanks once again for your generosity to our moderators. I appreciate that you all send your super chats and your PayPal donations, because every one of those goes directly to our moderators, and I couldn't do it without them, so I appreciate it. Why would any parent leave a toddler with a grandfather who had dementia? That's why the parents decided to go camping. Makes no sense. Well, I don't dispute that. Their discussion was that they thought that he was playing in the campground. Their story is they asked if he wanted to go with them. He said no, and so they said to grandpa, "You watch him while we go fishing." The little boy started to follow his parents. Grandpa thought that he had gone with them, and it wasn't until the parents came back about 20 minutes later that they sort of compared their stories and realized that neither one of them had him. That's their story. I'm not suggesting that it makes a lot of sense, but that's certainly their what they say happened. Um, there was a lot of confusion about they went to a store, they had to buy some things, they came back, then the father took off in his truck because he said he was going somewhere to get a better cell signal, but the mother called 911 from the campground, so she had cell service. So there's always been a lot of confusion and conflicting versions about what really happened that day. And I agree that a sensible parent would not leave their child with a grandfather who had dementia, but I don't think that I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility either. So, Lori, what about the number of murdered children, especially by parents and foster parents? Do you think there has been an increase, or does it just seem that way? That's a really good question. I think the numbers may be up slightly, although probably not as much as the media would make it seem. So I think it's a combination of both. You raise an excellent point, and a point that I did juvenile work, including child welfare work, for years as part of my criminal defense work, and so I understand how fragile and tenuous those foster placements can be sometime. And I actually have had cases where a child died in foster care. One was a crib death, a very fragile infant, but at least two were as the result of, I wouldn't say abuse, but certainly neglect. So it's very difficult. It's difficult to be in a position of seeing children removed from parents who the child has a relationship with, and and perhaps isn't the most responsible parent, but then removed from the parent and sent to a foster home where then they die from neglect. That's a very difficult situation. What are your thoughts on using DNA databases to solve cold crimes? Golden State Killer and the Boy in the Box, for example. That's a great question, and it is an amazing technology that we didn't have 5 years ago. We didn't have these databases, Ancestry, 23andMe, um, all of those historical databases where people are posting their DNA results. And so we suddenly have this huge database that gives us a pool of people that we could not have compared DNA to before. Up until these home kits came about, people's DNA ended up on file with a government agency for a very narrow um, group of reasons. They were either convicted felons or they were people who were involved in law enforcement, first responders, um, and those sort of folks, people in the military, where there might be a chance at some point that there would be some sort of an accident and their bodies would have to be um, identified by their DNA, or that their DNA profiles had to be on file to be excluded from crime scenes. Um, so you had a really small pool of people who actually had their DNA on file with a federal or a law enforcement agency, and that went into the national database. But as we've seen with these databases, we suddenly have millions of people whose DNA is now on file and can be compared. There's a whole new uh, occupation. I don't know why I'm losing my words tonight, folks. There's a whole new occupation out there and a whole new uh, group of experts that now are genealogical uh, researchers and ancestry researchers and whose job it is to comb through DNA results and to find those close connections. And you'd be amazed at the number of events that happen as a result of those. So the Golden State Killer and the Boy in the Box are two of the most popular or most publicized results recently. The Golden State Killer was a man who had been a law enforcement officer, and he had, but clearly prior to DNA being collected routinely from law enforcement, and he escaped detection for decades as a rapist and a murderer. And it wasn't until um, it, some of these DNA databases were being mined for information that matches were discovered and he was identified. The Boy in the Box, maybe somebody can help me with the time frame. It seems to me that this boy's remains were discovered in the 70s, and he was just recently, within the last month or so, identified thanks to genealogical and DNA research. So um, I think that we're going to see more and more of these cases solved by that. And then it raises this whole other question about how do we keep our own DNA results um, private, and when does that become a Fourth Amendment illegal search issue? Um, we know that in the past, somebody puts their garbage out on the street corner, and investigators go through and find a glass with somebody's DNA on it, or a hairbrush or toothbrush, and they're able to link somebody by picking up their DNA. But how accessible is that going to be? Our own citizens' DNA going to be if we are part of these DNA databases? Um, I mean, it's a very interesting question. My family all did Ancestry and 23andMe a while back. We had some questions. Thank you, MM. His body was found in 1953. I didn't realize it was that far back, but thank you. Because this is a person who deserved to be identified and to be buried on in, in his own name. Yeah. Thank you, Kathleen. He has been identified, and that is, I think that's huge. I think that it appears from what I've seen in the news that he was a child that they assume was abused, and probably abused to the point of being murdered. And I think it would have been sad for him to have gone indefinitely unidentified and unmourned and lost in history. So I think those are all really important advances that we're making in our technology. Um, Certainly, we know that technology is always a double-edged sword. We know that for every really great advance in technology, we open Pandora's box when it comes to other issues. So then we have to ask, well, how do we manage the fact that now that our DNA is in a database, how do we manage the fact that that is still private information? Can insurance companies mine that data and discover whether or not we have a genetic propensity for a certain medical condition and jack up our medical insurance or our life insurance? Um, can creditors use those databases to find deadbeat relatives who aren't paying their bills? That I mean, there are a number of questions that arise from the issue of voluntarily putting yourself on a database. If I voluntarily put myself on a database hoping to connect with distant family members, and law enforcement uses it somehow to connect me to a historical crime, is that an illegal search? Because they're not using the database for what I intended it to be. I think those are questions that are going to have to be resolved by state Supreme Courts and maybe ultimately by the federal Supreme Court. So interesting questions. Those are the kind of things that keep me up at night. Darlene, this is a really good question. How likely is it that a crime will be prosecuted without a body? No body murder cases are incredibly difficult because we rely on a great deal on the forensic information that comes with a body. It can be something as simple as pinpointing the time of death or pinpointing the method of death. And when you don't have a body, you don't have the option to do that. I can tell you about a case that happened in the community that I lived in. The woman was a much beloved emergency room nurse who, in a small community, everybody knows the folks that work in the ER. And she was a very popular person, really outdoorsy, and she was married. It was clear to the people who were around her that her marriage was disintegrating, and it was not a long-term marriage, and it was clear to her friends that um, she shouldn't have married this guy and that the marriage wasn't going well. There were some of her friends that were deeply concerned about whether or not she was being abused, and there were a lot of folks that were very concerned about her safety. And one evening she didn't show up for work, which was very unlike her, and triggered an investigation. They found discovered that the husband, who had a toy hauler trailer, so an enclosed trailer that you would put a snowmobile or an ATV on to haul it to a recreational area. And that trailer had been seen along the river, in an area that was very at a time when the river was running very high, and it was a um, fast moving at the in the spring during the melt. And so searchers descended on the river and were searching for her body, and everyone utterly convinced that her husband had murdered her. They confiscated the toy hauler trailer and did a search of his home. Of course, the search of the home turned up blood, and also a great deal of blood in the toy hauler trailer. Several days later, two fishermen were out on the river, and spotted what they believed was her body. But the river was moving so fast that by the time the search and rescue or law enforcement got there to recover the body, it had continued its travel downriver, and the body was never recovered. Under those circumstances, law enforcement was able to prove that the amount of blood that was in this toy hauler trailer was incompatible with someone living, and they were able to identify that it was her blood. It was uh, connected to her by DNA, and they were able to say, an expert was able to say, the quantity of blood that was in that toy hauler trailer was incompatible with someone losing that much blood and living through it. And they were able to get a conviction um, on on in that case. It went to trial, and they were able to get a conviction in the case in spite of the fact that they didn't have a body. But that was somewhat unusual. Um, Prosecuting a case like Michael Vaughn's without um, some concrete evidence that he's deceased, some physical evidence, as well as some corroborating evidence from witnesses. That's going to be tough. I don't. It's not impossible, but I think that any prosecutor would tell you a no-body prosecution is an uphill climb. So, good question, Darlene. Thank you. Curious cat. Any news on Letitia Stout? I haven't checked in on that case in a while, but I will. She is she's a very odd bird, um, and the last I understood was she had once again tried to claim that she was incompetent and had been found competent, but I don't know when that trial is scheduled, so I'll have to look that up. Um, I tell you, there are so many cases out there. Will I be covering the Murdaugh case? The Murdaugh case is fascinating to me from a bunch of legal aspects. Um, a- and I don't know that I will be covering it. I'm sure we'll be talking about it. But there are two podcasters, two YouTube creators who are covering it. One is Mandy Matney. She is an investigative journalist from that area, has been covering the Murdaugh case for like 4 years since the boat crash originally. Um, and she is just a wealth of knowledge. They were recently last week or week before covering the trial of Russell Laffitte, who was an associate of Murdaugh's, and he was the bank president and at Palmetto State Bank, and was recently found guilty of a lot of financial shenanigans and theft of um, money from people who he had a fiduciary duty to. So it's a really interesting case. I know that Mandy Matney is going to be covering it wall to wall, and she is so good. Her podcast is called the Murdaugh Murder Podcast, and I also know that Gigi from Pretty Lies and Alibis said she will be covering it, doing daily recaps. So I don't want to um, give y'all repetitive information. I will be following the case. Absolutely. I've followed it from the beginning, but your best sources are going to be Gigi at Pretty Lies and Alibis and Mandy Matney at the Murdaugh Murder Podcast. Like I say, Mandy has been on this case since its beginning, and she's forgotten more about this case than most people know. So I think there are other cases that I could do better justice to, just because they're cases that might be a little bit closer in geographically, or might be a little bit more, have uh, a few more legal issues that y'all might find interesting. So we'll look for those. Darlene, good question. How does a polygraph test help law enforcement and not be admissible in court? So, when we talked about junk science and about questioning science, polygraphs have always, the science behind them has always been questionable. But where a polygraph really helps is if you have a person who's not very sophisticated and you hook them up to all this stuff and they're wired and they have a band around here and they have electrodes and everything, you make them believe, even if the polygraph is inconclusive, you make them believe that you can tell if they're lying. And that is the advantage for law enforcement of using a polygraph. Polygraphs are not admissible. They're not reliable. I would never recommend that a client take a polygraph because I think that it just muddies the waters. But the only place where polygraphs have proven to be helpful and effective is in some forms of SO treatment. I'm using the letters because I don't want YouTube to get upset with us. And they tend to get upset when you use certain words. So, in the case where you have someone who has been convicted of of an SO crime, and they are required to do treatment, often they will be required to take what's called a full disclosure polygraph. And it kind of works the same way because the interviewer is going to say, are there any other offenses we don't know about? Are there any other victims we don't know about? Now is your opportunity to disclose those before we do this polygraph. And oftentimes it's effective. People will make those disclosures. But from a true investigative standpoint, my opinion is they're fairly useless. We know that there have been some very famous serial killers who have repeatedly passed polygraphs. The one that comes to mind is Ridgway, who was the Green River Killer in the Seattle area. He operated in the Seattle area, and he's one of the most prolific serial killers. And the entire time, he was investigated more than once because his kind of distinctive vehicle was seen. He preyed on prostitutes. And so his vehicle was seen sort of cruising the areas where around SeaTac where there was a heavy population of prostitutes. And he was pulled in for questioning more than once and given more than one polygraph and passed them all. So I think they're not reliable. That's why they've never been admissible in court. But certainly law enforcement uses them and makes people believe that they're reliable. Good questions tonight. Hi, MJ. Any updates on the Idaho 4 murders? No, but I do have some things to say about this. I think that it is deplorable that there are creators out there who are purposefully circulating inaccurate or untrue information for their own entertainment and um, for their own clicks. It's absolutely deplorable, and we keep seeing that happen. Now, I agree that when law enforcement isn't very good at walking that fine line between giving out too much information and giving out not enough, things flow into that vacuum. So in this case, we definitely have a vacuum. We do not have enough information. The public is not getting enough information in an instance where we have potentially a violent offender, a murderer, among wandering around on a college campus. Someone who has already murdered 4 college students in that community. So it's certainly of a concern to the community and to community at large that we need to know that progress is being made on this case. That said, it's just wrong to have creators out there creating into that vacuum, creating what they know are untrue or inaccurate uh, um, content. So I was listening to a podcast and they were interviewing some law enforcement experts. And in fact, I heard Joseph Scott Morgan talking about this case. For those of you who don't know, Joseph Scott Morgan is a forensic expert, and he has a podcast called Body Bags. He was being interviewed about the Idaho case, and he pointed out, and rightfully so, I think, that this is a case that has volumes and volumes of forensic evidence. The reason why law enforcement has spent the better part of a month in that residence where the murders happened is because of the abundance of information that's available. Combing through that information is very time and labor intensive. And I have no doubt at this point that they have people working literally around the clock, trying to sift through and analyze that information and to be able to come up with um, it, something that might lead them to the perpetrator. I also understand the anxiety of the community and the anxiety of the parents of these beautiful young people whose lives were cut short. Um, my own daughter is not that far away from having been a college student. I think I remarked that the apartment that these young people lived in looked remarkably similar to one my daughter lived in when she was in college, not in Idaho, but and so it hits close to home for those of us who have kids at that age. And it's certainly you can certainly empathize with the parents who want answers now and the community who is terrified that this person is still out among them and unidentified. But I had to agree with Joseph Scott Morgan that um, that he thought that it was going to be quite a long time before we got any concrete results out of that. Lee here. Can it be found out if someone is paying for Chud's legal fees? That Chud is Chad Daybell, I'm assuming. I don't think so. Um, who pays your legal fees or where that money comes from is a private matter. The court is not going to insist that he disclose that information. We do not know at this point whether there is anybody paying those legal fees, whether John Pryor is working for free, whether he is trying to find people who are equally willing to work for free. We don't know that. And I would be very surprised if we ever get that information. I mean, I suppose after trial it might come out, but there's no way to force that information. Hey, brown-eyed girl. Why does everyone expect law enforcement to tell them every detail before an arrest? Also, it's disgusting they're being called incompetent. That's just not how it works. The case is far from cold. Well, I agree. I I realize that a lot of this stems from frustration on the part of the families of the victims, frustration on the part of a community who's really on edge. And I realize that that's where this comes from. This we got to blame somebody because nothing's happening. I think that we are unjustly programmed by what we watch on television that a crime is going to be wrapped up in a neat little bow in 60 minutes, and that, if somebody says I need this DNA analyzed, the results are back 10 seconds later instead of weeks or months later. So those all color our expectations of how quickly we think that a situation like this should be resolved or a perpetrator should be identified. That colors our expectations. I've pointed this out before. Oftentimes, and I want to say this because I know that one of the parents has expressed some deep concerns about the competence of the police force. And I pointed this out before, and it is true. What happens is a young person wants to become a police officer. They go to school, maybe they get a criminal justice degree. They then apply to a police force. Smaller jurisdictions are more likely to hire less experienced officers. They get hired, they go to the police academy, they spend 6 months or so in the police academy, depending on the state and the way that their academy is structured. Some do in residence and then do distance. There's many ways that it happens. And they are qualified and to be sworn officers. Those young officers are learning their trade and getting their experience on these smaller police forces. Smaller jurisdictions don't always have these sort of high profile, very intense cases. So they're all kind of learning as they go. What often happens is once a young officer gets a few years of experience under their belt, they move to a larger jurisdiction. So it is sort of a pipeline for law enforcement officers going through the departments in smaller jurisdictions to learn how to be police. It means that these smaller jurisdictions often have less experienced officers. One of the parents of the victims was expressing concern about the fact that many of the officers on the force are the same age as the victims, and that they felt that they were not that they were not up to the task. I don't think that's true at all. I think in some cases, having young people who are right out of the academy, they have the best information. They have the best training, the most current training. And sometimes it's the old dinosaur who's been on the force for 30 years, who's not up on the technology and who's not up on the current training. So it can cut both ways. Because of speedy trial, this is Tricia. Don't the police and FBI need all the evidence to be processed and returned before they make an arrest? This would make it so they wouldn't want to jump the gun, right? Yes, that is true. Before an arrest is made, the process is that law enforcement collects and gathers all the information, does some interpretation of it, saying we think this piece of evidence means this. And that information is turned over to the prosecutor. The prosecutor then decides whether there's sufficient evidence to bring charges, whether or not the prosecutor can prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. Which reminds me, somebody asked me if I would go over reasonable doubt. And I'm not going to do it tonight because we're running up against the hour, but I will have a discussion about reasonable doubt because burdens of proof are important. So to get back to this, um, they want to make sure that they have a case that they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. At that point, then they submit it either to a grand jury or there's a preliminary hearing to determine that there's sufficient evidence to go forward. And then an indictment is issued and the person is arraigned on the indictment. Those seem like formalities, they get a written indictment and then the person goes to court and the judge says, here's all the things that you're accused of. How do you plead? The person says not guilty. It seems very formulaic, but it's a super important part of it because it's that arraignment that triggers speedy trial. So, for example, in Lori Vallow's case, the indictments were issued almost a year, well, more than a year, I think, before she was indicted, before she was arraigned. Sorry, get my terms right. The indictment came down. She was served with the arrest warrant, and then she was found to be incompetent, and she went for treatment. During that period of time, she had not yet been arraigned. Had she been arraigned, that time would have told, meaning that it wouldn't have counted toward her speedy trial because she was incompetent and the case was stayed. But in her case, the arraignment actually didn't happen until she was declared competent in April of 2022. So, yes, they don't want to jump the gun. We don't want to have somebody held in custody for extended periods of time while there's an investigation going on. That is not the purpose of our criminal justice system. We do not hold people in custody while we investigate. Now, there are some strategies to get around that. For example, in the Vallow case, they brought charges that were something less than murder, and they held them on those particular charges. They were placeholder charges that were meant to keep them in jail, unable to flee and unable to tamper with evidence. So, but you're absolutely right, Tricia. We do not want to jump the gun. That's one of several reasons why the Delphi case was only just now indicted. Please subscribe to the newsletter if you haven't. I use the newsletter as a way to kind of take a deep dive into some legal issues. Some people find that really interesting. Other people, their eyes glaze over. I don't blame you either way. But if that is something that interests you, because we do get into a little bit more detail on legal issues, subscribe to the newsletter. You'll also find some other fun things there. You can find the address to send your self-addressed stamped envelope to get your wristband, your Justice for Tylee and JJ wristband. And this month, I've been posting some Christmas cookie and dessert recipes just for your enjoyment. Don't forget, we will have join us on Friday this week for TGIF, a recap of the Vallow Daybell case. And then next week, there will be no True Crime Wednesday and no TGIF for the week of Christmas. And so join us. If I don't see you on Friday, have a really Merry Christmas. Enjoy your family. And we'll see you back here next Wednesday or Wednesday after. I want to thank everybody for supporting our moderators, for sending your super chats as well as your PayPal donations. Thank you so much to our moderators, Michelle and Brenda, for their help tonight. And I'm wishing you all a good night.